December 18th, 1945. The first snowfall of winter descended upon Camp Shanks in Orangeburg, New York, transforming the sprawling military installation into something almost peaceful. Leutnant Frieda Baumann pressed her face against the cold window of Barracks 7, watching crystalline flakes drift through the amber glow of camp lights. She was 34 years old, thin as a rail, and had not seen her daughter Anneliese in 14 months. The last image burned into her memory was of a 7-year-old girl with blonde braids standing on a Berlin railway platform, her small hand clutching her grandmother's coat as Soviet artillery thundered in the distance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Frieda had served as a Nachrichtenhelferin, a communications helper in the Luftwaffe, coordinating radio traffic for fighter squadrons defending German cities from Allied bombing raids. Now she stood among 218 German women, prisoners of war, who had been transported across the Atlantic to American soil. They existed in a strange limbo between captivity and care, confined behind wire but treated with a correctness that defied everything Nazi propaganda had promised about Allied barbarism. The barracks was silent except for the occasional cough or whispered conversation. Most women lay on their bunks, lost in private reflections about families they might never see again. According to documentation from the National Archives holdings on prisoner of war operations, approximately 425,000 German POWs were held in camps across the continental United States by war's end. Female prisoners represented a tiny fraction of this number, perhaps 15,000 captured throughout all theaters, with only a few hundred transferred to American facilities due to their technical expertise or intelligence value. Frieda's transfer had been deliberate. American military intelligence wanted detailed information about Luftwaffe communication protocols, about the command structure's final collapse as the Reich disintegrated. She had cooperated, not out of ideological conversion, but from pragmatic recognition that the war was over, and her daughter's survival depended on whatever occupied Germany would become. The interrogations had been professional, almost clinical, nothing like the torture scenarios described in Wehrmacht training about what to expect if captured. Sergeant Catherine Morrison of the Women's Army Corps appeared at the barracks door, her breath visible in the cold air. Morrison was 28, a farm girl from Nebraska who had volunteered in 1942 after her fiancé died at Midway. She had requested assignment to the female POW section, partly from curiosity, partly from a conviction that someone needed to see these enemies as human beings, even if that humanity had been twisted by serving Hitler's regime. "Attention!" Morrison called out in careful German, one of 3 phrases she had mastered. The women rose from their bunks with mechanical efficiency, old habits persisting despite defeat. Morrison continued in English, gesturing for Frieda to translate. "Colonel Henderson wants to address all prisoners in the main hall at 1900 hours. Attendance is mandatory. Dress warmly." Speculation rippled through the barracks after Morrison departed. Gisela Hoffmann, a former Flakwaffenhelferin who had operated anti-aircraft guns defending Hamburg, voiced what others were thinking. Perhaps they are sending us home, or perhaps to trials. Her voice carried neither hope nor fear, just exhausted resignation. At 41, Gisela was among the oldest prisoners, her face deeply lined, her hands permanently scarred from handling ammunition in -20-degree weather during the war's final winter. Frieda shook her head. "Not gather us for deportation announcements. This is something else." She did not voice her deeper worry, that American public opinion had turned more hostile, that political pressure might force harsher treatment of German prisoners, now that the war was truly over and the full scope of Nazi atrocities was becoming undeniable. The walk to the main hall occurred in formation, guards flanking the column of women as they moved through Camp Shanks's orderly grid of buildings. The facility had been a major embarkation point for American troops heading to Europe. Over 1 million soldiers had passed through these gates between 1942 and 1945. Now it served multiple purposes, including housing this unusual population of female enemy combatants. The hall was a large wooden structure, heated by pot-belly stoves that fought valiantly against December's chill. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged, and American flags decorated the walls alongside posters explaining democratic principles in German translation. The women filed in silently, taking seats with the same discipline that had characterized their military service. Colonel Richard Henderson stood at the front, a career officer who had fought in France during the Great War and returned to service in 1941, despite being well past prime combat age. He was 58, his hair steel grey, his face bearing the weathered look of a man who had witnessed too much history. He waited until all prisoners were seated before beginning to speak, Frieda Baumann translating from her position near the front. "In 9 days, Americans will celebrate Christmas," Henderson said, his voice carrying the measured authority of command. "This holiday holds deep significance in our culture, commemorating faith, family, and peace among all people. We understand that Christmas also carries meaning in German culture, though your former government attempted to transform it into a celebration of Nazi ideology, rather than its Christian and humanitarian origins." Frieda translated carefully, noting how several women stiffened at this characterization of Nazi cultural policies. It was true, the regime had promoted Julfest and other pseudo-pagan celebrations while attempting to diminish Christianity's role, but many Germans had quietly maintained traditional Christmas observances in their homes despite official discouragement. Henderson continued, "American policy requires that prisoners of war be treated in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. We have provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care. But Christmas represents an opportunity to demonstrate something beyond mere compliance with international law. It represents an opportunity to acknowledge your humanity, even as we cannot forget the crimes committed by the regime you served." The women sat in tense silence. Some, like Frieda, had begun accepting their complicity in serving a genocidal system. Others remained in various stages of denial, minimizing their roles, claiming ignorance of concentration camps, insisting they had merely followed orders. The psychological complexity of reckoning with such collective guilt would take not months but generations to fully process. "We have learned," Henderson said, his tone softening slightly, "that many of you have children in Germany, children you have not seen since your capture, children facing a winter of deprivation in a devastated nation." He paused, letting Frieda's translation catch up. "We cannot reunite you with your families yet. Repatriation processes remain complex, dependent on denazification, screening, and logistical challenges. But we can acknowledge that your children exist, that they matter, that even in war's aftermath, certain human bonds transcend political divisions." Frieda felt her throat tighten. Where was this going? What could Americans possibly offer except words? Henderson gestured to Sergeant Morrison, who opened a side door. A group of American soldiers entered, carrying large cardboard boxes that they set on tables at the front of the hall. "We cannot give you much," Henderson said, "but we can give you this. The Red Cross has approved a program allowing prisoners to prepare Christmas packages for their children in Germany. Small items, candy, simple toys, letters, nothing of military value, everything will be inspected. But something to let your children know their mothers remember them, that across the ocean someone thinks of them during this holiday season." The impact of these words hit the assembled women like a physical force. Several gasped audibly. Gisela Hoffmann's weathered face crumpled, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks. Younger prisoners like 22-year-old Liesel Kruger, who had served as a radio operator in Berlin until the city's fall, stared in disbelief as though they had misheard the translation. Frieda's voice shook as she completed the translation. She thought of Anneliese, now 8 years old if she still lived, somewhere in the Soviet occupation zone with Frieda's mother. The possibility of sending something, anything, even if it never reached its destination, felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. Henderson raised his hand for quiet. "There is more. On Christmas Day, we will host a special gathering for prisoners and their families." Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. What families? They were thousands of miles from home, imprisoned behind barbed wire in a foreign nation, Henderson clarified. "We have located and invited the children of prisoners currently held at Camp Shanks, children who were brought to America before the war, who have American relatives or guardians. Tomorrow, representatives from social services will meet with any prisoner who believes their child may be in the United States. We cannot promise success, but we will attempt to arrange visits for Christmas Day. The hall erupted into chaos, women shouting questions, weeping, demanding clarification. Frieda sat frozen, her mind racing. Could Anneliese possibly be in America? No, it was impossible. She had been in Berlin in February of 1945, the last time Frieda had any confirmed information. Unless Frieda's mother had somehow gotten her out. Frieda's mother had a sister who had immigrated to New York in 1936, fleeing the regime's increasing persecution of anyone with Jewish ancestry, even distant connections. Could they have, possibly? Sergeant Morrison moved among the prisoners, distributing forms in German. Fill these out tonight. Child's name, last known location, any relatives in America who might have taken custody. Return them tomorrow morning. Her voice carried professional efficiency, but her eyes showed something else, recognition of the extraordinary nature of what was being attempted. The barracks that night was unlike anything Frieda had experienced since capture. Women who had maintained stoic distance suddenly shared intimate details about their children. Photographs were passed around, precious smuggled images that had survived capture and confiscation. Gisela showed a picture of her two sons, 15-year-old Hans and 13-year-old Werner, last seen in Hamburg before she was deployed to Berlin's defense in the war's final months. They were supposed to be evacuated to the countryside, Gisela whispered. But I received no confirmation. I do not know if they survived the bombing. Liesel Kruger had no children of her own, but she listened to the older women's stories with an expression of dawning understanding. She had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, educated to believe that Germans were a master race, that enemies deserved extermination, that victory was Germany's destiny. Now, imprisoned by those enemies, she watched American soldiers offering German mothers the chance to contact children they might never see again. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Frieda filled out her form with trembling hands. Child's name, Anneliese Baumann. Age, 8. Last known location, Berlin. American relative, sister of her grandmother, Clara Lowenstein, address unknown, believed to be in New York City. It seemed hopeless, a desperate lottery ticket. But hope, once ignited, proved impossible to extinguish. According to research compiled by historian Mitchell Yockelson in his work on POW programs, American military authorities struggled throughout 1945 with balancing security concerns, public opinion, and humanitarian obligations toward German prisoners. Many American citizens harbored deep hostility toward anything German, understandable given the war's cost in American lives and the revelation of Holocaust atrocities. Yet individual soldiers and administrators, confronted with the immediate reality of suffering, often made humane decisions that exceeded strict policy requirements. The Christmas program at Camp Shanks represented one such initiative. Colonel Henderson had proposed it over objections from some staff who argued it would be perceived as coddling enemies. Henderson's counter-argument was pragmatic rather than purely humanitarian. Germany needed to be rebuilt as a democratic society, and that required Germans capable of teaching their children different values than those that had led to Nazism. Demonstrating that democracy included compassion, even toward defeated enemies, might plant seeds that would bear fruit in future generations. The following morning, December 19th, Frieda and 43 other women who had submitted forms met with representatives from the American Red Cross and military social services. The process was bureaucratic and frustrating, involving telephone calls, telegrams, searches through refugee databases and immigration records. Most inquiries led nowhere. Last known addresses were in Soviet-occupied territories where communication remained nearly impossible. American relatives had different surnames, making tracing difficult. Children had been killed in bombing raids or died from disease and starvation during the war's chaotic final months, but some connections were made. An administrator named Dorothy Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American whose own family had faced discrimination despite being citizens, spent 8 hours on the telephone tracking down a lead about a child matching Frieda's description. Chen had volunteered for this work partly from idealism, believing that post-war reconciliation required seeing enemies as human beings capable of transformation. On December 21st, Dorothy Chen appeared at Barracks 7, looking exhausted but satisfied. She asked for Frieda Baumann. When Frieda identified herself, Chen smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired face. "We found her. Your daughter Anneliese is alive and living in Brooklyn with your great-aunt Clara Lowenstein. Clara managed to get both Anneliese and your mother out of Berlin in March of 1945, just before the Soviet siege closed the city. They travelled through Switzerland using visas Clara had been fighting to obtain for 2 years. They arrived in New York in April." Frieda's legs gave out. She collapsed onto her bunk, hands covering her face as sobs racked her thin frame. Anneliese was alive. In America. In Brooklyn, barely an hour from Camp Shanks. The improbability of it defied comprehension, yet here was proof that sometimes impossible things happened. Chen knelt beside Frieda, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's well. Clara has been caring for her. Your mother passed away in September. I'm sorry. Heart failure, the doctor said, but probably as much grief and exhaustion as medical cause. Anneliese has been attending school, learning English. Clara wanted to contact you but had no way to locate you until our inquiry." "Can I?" Frieda could barely form words. "Can I see her?" "On Christmas Day," Chen confirmed. "Colonel Henderson has approved a supervised visit. 2 hours. Clara will bring Anneliese to the camp. There are rules. No physical contact across the barrier. Conversations will be monitored. But yes, you will see your daughter." Word of Frieda's fortune spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire. Of the 44 women who had submitted inquiries, only 5 had children successfully located in the United States. The odds were devastating, yet those 5 represented miracles to women who had expected never to see their children again. The other 39 faced renewed grief, their hopes raised only to be confirmed as impossible. Gisela Hoffmann was among those who received no news. Her sons remained unaccounted for in Soviet-occupied Hamburg. She listened to Frieda's story with an expression that mixed genuine happiness for her fellow prisoner with barely suppressed anguish at her own continued uncertainty. "You must tell Anneliese everything," Gisela said quietly that evening. "Tell her the truth about what we served, about what Germany did. Do not let her grow up with the lies we were fed." The days leading to Christmas passed in a strange emotional landscape. The women who would see their children existed in a state of nervous anticipation that made sleep nearly impossible. They obsessed over what they would say, how their children would react to seeing mothers in prisoner uniforms behind barbed wire. Would the children understand? Would they feel shame? Would years of separation have eroded bonds beyond repair? Meanwhile, all prisoners participated in the Christmas package program. The Red Cross provided materials: small bags of candy, colored pencils, simple cloth dolls, wooden toys carved by American soldiers in their off hours. The women were allowed to write letters, subject to censorship, explaining where they were and that they thought of their children constantly. These packages would be shipped to Germany through Red Cross channels, with no guarantee they would reach their intended recipients, but the act of preparing them provided purpose and a small measure of agency. Liesel Kruger, who had no children of her own, volunteered to help others prepare packages. She found herself working alongside Sergeant Morrison, an unexpected partnership between enemy and captor. Morrison had brought additional supplies from her own funds, chocolate bars from the PX, small American flags that some prisoners included as gestures toward the new order emerging from war's ruins. "Why are you doing this?" Liesel asked in her improving English. "We are enemies. We served Hitler. Why show us kindness?" Morrison considered the question while tying ribbon around a package. "My fiancé died fighting your countrymen. I have every reason to hate you, but hatred accomplishes nothing except creating more suffering. These children didn't start the war. They didn't build concentration camps. They're just kids who need to know somebody cares about them. Maybe if we show German children that Americans can be kind, They'll grow up different than their parents' generation. The answer troubled Liesel because it implied a moral superiority she was increasingly unable to deny. Nazi propaganda had taught that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of the discipline necessary for greatness. Yet here were Americans demonstrating strength through compassion, achieving through mercy what Germany had failed to achieve through cruelty. December 24th arrived with clear, cold skies and temperatures well below freezing. The camp took on a festive appearance, American soldiers having decorated common areas with evergreen branches, handmade ornaments, and strings of lights powered by generators. For the prisoners, the decorations carried complex meanings. Christmas had been part of German culture long before the Nazis, but the regime had attempted to co-opt the holiday, stripping away Christian elements and emphasizing Aryan mythology and militarism. Now, seeing Christmas celebrated in its traditional form by their conquerors, the women confronted yet another way. Nazi ideology had corrupted something beautiful. Colonel Henderson authorized a special Christmas Eve service, led by an army chaplain who spoke fluent German, having served as a missionary in Frankfurt before the war. Attendance was voluntary, but nearly all prisoners came, seeking comfort in familiar rituals, even if their faith had been shaken by catastrophe. The chaplain, Captain William Strauss, was 54, a Lutheran minister who had fled Germany in 1938 after refusing to swear loyalty to Hitler. His sermon was brief but powerful, focusing on themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of transformation. The birth of Christ represents hope entering a dark world, Strauss said in German. Not hope earned through righteousness, but hope offered freely to all who recognize their need for grace. You have served a regime that committed terrible sins. Some of you bear direct responsibility for specific crimes. Others enabled evil through passive compliance. But the message of Christmas is that no one exists beyond the possibility of redemption if they truly repent and commit to different paths. Frieda listened with tears streaming down her face. She did not know if she believed in redemption, at least not for herself. The knowledge of what she had enabled, the communications she had facilitated that helped Luftwaffe squadrons bomb cities, kill civilians, prolong a war that served genocidal ends, all of this weighed on her conscience with crushing force. Yet tomorrow she would see Anneliese. Tomorrow she would look into her daughter's eyes and have 2 hours to begin explaining the inexplicable. After the service, Sergeant Morrison distributed small gifts to the prisoners, packages from the Red Cross containing toiletries, warm socks, bars of soap, small luxuries that carried symbolic weight beyond their material value. Gisela Hoffmann, who would not see her sons tomorrow, who had no confirmation they even lived, accepted her package with quiet dignity. She opened it alone at her bunk, away from the other's eyes, and allowed herself to weep silently into her pillow. That night, Frieda lay awake, listening to the sounds of other women breathing, coughing, occasionally crying. Tomorrow would bring something unprecedented. German prisoners of war meeting their children on American soil on Christmas Day 1945. The historical irony was almost too heavy to contemplate. Germany had conquered much of Europe, had seemed invincible for a time, had promised its people glory and living space and a 1,000-year Reich. Instead, German children would spend Christmas visiting mothers behind barbed wire, the defeated remnants of an ideology that had promised everything and delivered only catastrophe. Through the barracks window, Frieda could see stars brilliant in the cold December sky. The same stars visible over Berlin, over Hamburg, over all the destroyed cities of Germany where children huddled in ruins and occupation soldiers distributed food to prevent mass starvation. Tomorrow, somewhere in one of those ruined cities, a German mother might receive the package Frieda had prepared, might show her child the letter and small gifts, might tell that child that across the ocean someone remembered and cared. And tomorrow, here at Camp Shanks, Anneliese would walk through gates, and for 2 hours the war's machinery would pause, and something as simple and profound as a mother seeing her daughter would occur despite everything that had tried to prevent it. Christmas morning, December 25th, 1945, dawned cold and brilliant. Frieda rose before reveille, unable to remain in bed despite having slept perhaps 2 hours. She washed carefully with the limited facilities available, using the bar of soap from her Red Cross package, attempting to make herself presentable for Anneliese. Her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform was clean but worn, patches visible where she had mended tears. She had no civilian clothes, no way to appear as anything other than what she was, a prisoner of war, a defeated servant of a criminal regime. The 5 women who would see their children that day gathered in a separate room after breakfast. They sat mostly in silence, each lost in private anticipation and dread. Dorothy Chen arrived at 10 o'clock with clipboards containing release forms and instructions. "The visits will occur in the administrative building's conference room," she explained. "You will sit on one side of a table, your child on the other. An armed guard will be present at all times, as well as a translator if needed. You may speak freely, but you may not pass items across the table without permission. Each visit is limited to 2 hours. Do you understand?" The women nodded. Frieda found she could barely breathe. In less than an hour, she would see Anneliese for the first time in 14 months. Her daughter was 8 now, had survived Berlin's fall and a transatlantic journey, had learned a new language and adapted to a foreign country. How much had she changed? Would she remember her mother clearly, or would Frieda have become a hazy figure, more myth than memory? At 11 o'clock, a guard came for Frieda first. She followed him across the compound, her legs trembling with each step. The administrative building was warmer than the barracks, heated by a coal furnace that made the air thick and slightly smoky. The conference room was small, containing a single rectangular table with chairs on either side. A soldier stood in the corner, rifle slung over his shoulder, his young face carefully neutral. And then the door opened, and Clara Lowenstein entered, holding Anneliese's hand. Frieda's first thought was how much her daughter had grown. Anneliese was taller, thinner, her face losing the roundness of early childhood. She wore a dress that was clearly American-made, probably purchased by Clara with precious savings. Her blonde hair was neatly braided, but her eyes, those dark eyes that had come from Frieda's side of the family, were the same. They widened upon seeing her mother, and for a moment time suspended, mother and daughter separated by 8 feet of space and an ocean of history staring at each other across an unbridgeable chasm. "Mama?" Anneliese whispered, and then she was crying, trying to run to Frieda but held back by Clara's gentle but firm grip. "She cannot cross the barrier," the guard said in German. "Please remain seated." Frieda sank into a chair, her own tears blurring vision. "Anneliese, my darling, you are alive. You are here." She switched to German, then English, then back to German, her languages tangling under emotional strain. Clara guided Anneliese to the opposite chair. The old woman looked exhausted, her face deeply lined, her movements slow with age and grief. She had lost her niece, Frieda's mother, just 3 months earlier. She had taken responsibility for a great niece she barely knew, bringing her to America, caring for her, navigating bureaucracy and expense, despite being 78 years old herself. "Thank you," Frieda said to Clara in German. "Thank you for saving her, for bringing her here. I have no words adequate for what you have done." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. "Your mother asked me with her last breath to care for Anneliese. I gave my word. But you should thank the Americans. They are the ones who found you, who arranged this." Her voice carried weight of lived history, a Jewish woman who had fled Hitler's Germany and now returned to thank the Americans who defeated the regime that had sought her destruction. For the next 2 hours, Frieda spoke with her daughter, a conversation monitored by guards but granted remarkable privacy given the circumstances. She asked about Anneliese's life in Brooklyn, about school, about whether Clara was kind to her. Anneliese answered in a mixture of German and English, her native language already showing signs of erosion, being displaced by the language of her new home. "Do you understand where I am?" Frieda asked carefully. "Do you understand what happened?" Anneliese nodded, her young face serious beyond her years. Aunt Clara explained. "Germany lost the war. You were captured. You are a prisoner now." She paused, then asked the question that haunted her. "Are you a bad person, Mama? Did you do bad things?" The question, coming from her 8-year-old daughter, struck Frieda with devastating force. How did one explain complicity to a child? How did one admit to enabling evil while maintaining any claim to parental authority? She chose honesty, because Gisela was right. Truth was the only path forward, however painful. "I served a very bad government," Frieda said slowly. "I did not personally hurt people, but my work helped Germany fight a war that should never have been fought. I knew our leaders were lying to us, but I did not ask enough questions. I believed things that were not true because believing them was easier than facing hard truths. This makes me responsible for terrible things, even if I did not do them directly. I am not a monster, Anneliese, but I am not innocent either. I am someone who must live with what she enabled and try to do better." Anneliese absorbed this with the seriousness children bring to concepts beyond their full comprehension. "The Americans feed us," she said. "Aunt Clara says they are good people, that they saved me. They are showing mercy to defeated enemies," Frieda replied. "They are demonstrating what civilization should be. Remember this, my darling. Remember that when Germany was evil, America chose to be good. Learn from them, become someone better than your mother's generation." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 2 hours passed simultaneously too quickly and with excruciating slowness. There was so much to say, too much to explain, emotions too complex for language to adequately convey. When the guard announced that time had expired, both mother and daughter wept openly. Clara rose, gently guiding Anneliese toward the door. The girl looked back repeatedly, her face twisted with grief at this second separation. "I will write to you," Frieda called out. "They say I can send letters through the Red Cross. I will write every week, I promise." "I love you, Mama," Anneliese said in English, the language of her new home, and then she was gone, the door closing behind her with terrible finality. Frieda sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, the guard respectfully silent in his corner. She had seen her daughter. Anneliese was alive, safe, cared for in ways that Germany could not have provided even if the war had ended differently. Yet the cost of this safety was separation, exile, the permanent fracturing of their family. Frieda's mother was dead, buried in foreign soil. Anneliese would grow up American, her German identity fading like old photographs exposed to too much Sunday. And Frieda, assuming she eventually returned to Germany, would rebuild her life in a nation of ruins, forever marked by the choices she had made during the Reich's dark years. The other 4 visits that occurred throughout Christmas Day followed similar patterns. Mothers seeing children they thought lost, conversations struggling to bridge months or years of separation, guards maintaining security while granting remarkable emotional privacy. By evening, when all visits had concluded, the 5 women gathered in Barracks 7, each processing her experience in silence, punctuated by occasional shared observations. "My daughter asked if I killed anyone," said Margarete Fischer, who had served in an administrative role in the Wehrmacht headquarters. "I told her no, but that I helped people who did." She did not understand the distinction. How could she? She is only 6 years old. The broader population of Camp Shanks observed Christmas with traditions that felt both familiar and alien to the prisoners. There was a chapel service, a feast featuring turkey and all the traditional accompaniments, decorations and songs, celebrating peace on earth and goodwill toward all. But for Frieda and the others who had seen their children, the holiday had become something more personal and painful, a reminder of all they had lost and all that remained uncertain. That evening, after the official celebrations concluded, Sergeant Morrison brought the 5 mothers hot cocoa, a gesture unauthorized by any regulation but prompted by simple human compassion. "I thought you might need something warm," she said simply, distributing tin cups filled with the rich, sweet beverage. Frieda accepted her cup with trembling hands. Hot cocoa, a simple thing, insignificant in the broader scope of history, yet at this moment it carried weight beyond its physical substance. She thought of Anneliese drinking cocoa in Clara's Brooklyn apartment, safe and warm. She thought of the children in ruined German cities who had no cocoa, no safety, no certainty about tomorrow. And she thought about the strange grace of this moment, enemy soldiers providing comfort to defeated women who had served a regime those soldiers had sacrificed to defeat. The cocoa was hot, sweet, perfect. It tasted like something from before the war, from a time when such pleasures had been ordinary rather than precious. Frieda drank it slowly, savouring each sip, while tears slid down her cheeks unchecked. Gisela Hoffmann sat beside her, also weeping silently, her own cup untouched. Gisela had not seen her sons today. She did not know if they lived. She had no cocoa waiting for them in any Brooklyn apartment, no American great-aunt providing salvation. Yet she accepted the cup Morrison offered and drank, because sometimes accepting grace, even undeserved grace, was the only response available to those who had enabled terrible things and now faced the consequences. According to historical documentation from the American Red Cross and military archives, the Christmas program at Camp Shanks represented an unusual experiment in post-war prisoner treatment. Similar programs were not implemented at most POW facilities, where security concerns and public opinion pressures limited humanitarian initiatives beyond Geneva Convention minimums. Colonel Henderson faced criticism from some quarters for his decisions, accused of excessive sympathy toward enemies. Yet Henderson defended his choices with pragmatic arguments. Germany needed to be rebuilt as a democratic society, he argued in reports to his superiors. That reconstruction required Germans capable of rejecting the ideology that had led to Nazism, demonstrating that democracy included compassion, even toward defeated enemies, might influence how these women raised their children and what values they transmitted to the next generation. Whether such calculations justified the program remained debatable, but the immediate human impact was undeniable. The days following Christmas brought a subtle but profound shift in the camp's atmosphere. The 5 women who had seen their children carried themselves differently, moving through daily routines with renewed purpose. They had something to live for beyond mere survival, a reason to return eventually to whatever Germany would become, even if that return meant years of separation from children now safe in America. Frieda Baumann began attending the educational programs offered at Camp Shanks with new intensity. American authorities, influenced by denazification policies being implemented in occupied Germany, had decided that POWs should receive instruction in democratic values and accurate history before repatriation. These classes were voluntary but encouraged, with participation noted in prisoner files that would influence repatriation timing and screening decisions. The instructor was Professor Ernst Kaufmann, a German émigré who had fled to America in 1933 when Hitler took power. He was 67 years old, white-haired and thin, but his voice carried force when he spoke about the lies that had consumed his homeland. He conducted classes in German, speaking to the assembled prisoners with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You were not victims," Kaufmann told them during a session in early January of 1946. "Or rather, you were victims of your own choices. You chose to believe propaganda that portrayed Jewish people as subhuman. You chose to accept explanations that made aggressive war seem defensive. You chose comfort over conscience. These were choices, not inevitable destinies." Some prisoners resisted these lectures, maintaining defensive postures about their service. Others, like Frieda, absorbed Kaufmann's words with the desperation of drowning people grasping for understanding. She needed to comprehend how she had become complicit, how an educated woman with no particular hatred in her heart had enabled a genocidal regime. The answer Kaufmann provided was uncomfortable but rang true. Complicity rarely required active evil, merely passive acceptance and willful blindness. During one session focused specifically on the Holocaust, Kaufmann presented documentation that many prisoners found impossible to accept. Photographs from liberated concentration camps showing piles of skeletal corpses, testimony from survivors describing gas chambers disguised as showers, statistical analysis estimating 6 million Jewish deaths, along with millions of Roma, disabled persons, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Liesl Kruger, the young former radio operator who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, physically recoiled from the images. "This cannot be true," she whispered. Our government would not. We were not monsters. Your government was precisely that monstrous, Kaufmann replied without softening his words. And you were not monsters, which makes it worse in some ways. Monsters we can dismiss as aberrations. But you were ordinary people who enabled extraordinary evil through ordinary choices. This is the truth you must accept if Germany is to have any future worth having. Frieda raised her hand, her voice shaking. I have a daughter who will grow up in America. What do I tell her about what Germany did? How do I explain that her mother served this regime? Kaufmann's expression softened slightly. You tell her the truth without evasion or minimization. You explain that good people can make terrible choices when they stop questioning authority, when they prioritize personal safety over moral courage, when they accept convenient lies rather than demanding difficult truths. You teach her to recognize the warning signs, to resist propaganda, to defend those who are targeted. You make your past a lesson rather than a burden she must carry without understanding. These conversations continued throughout January and February of 1946. The women grappled with guilt, denial, rationalization, and gradually, for some, genuine reckoning. The process was painful and incomplete. Human beings possess remarkable capacity for self-deception, and accepting full responsibility for enabling genocide required psychological work that many prisoners could not or would not undertake. Meanwhile, the Christmas packages prepared by the prisoners began reaching Germany through Red Cross channels. The success rate was low, perhaps 30% of packages actually delivered to intended recipients. War had shattered Germany's infrastructure, and the division into occupation zones complicated mail delivery. Soviet authorities in particular often confiscated packages, viewing them as suspicious or claiming they contained contraband. But some packages arrived. In early February, Gisela Hoffmann received a letter forwarded through the Red Cross from her son Hans in Hamburg. The letter was brief, written in the careful script of a 15-year-old trying to sound adult. Dear Mama, we received your package. The candy was very good. We shared it with our neighbors who have even less than us. Werner and I are living with Uncle Friedrich, Papa's brother. The city is mostly destroyed, but we have a room with a roof. We go to school when it is open. We are glad to know you are alive. Please come home when you can. Your loving son, Hans. Gisela read the letter 17 times before her hands stopped shaking. Both sons alive, living with family, attending school. The relief was so profound it felt physically painful, as though tension held for months suddenly released, leaving her muscles weak and trembling. She wept openly in the barracks, not caring who saw, clutching the letter like a sacred text. They are alive, she kept repeating. My boys are alive. The letter transformed Gisela's remaining time at Camp Shanks. She had been among the most withdrawn prisoners, maintaining defensive distance from both captors and fellow captives. Now she engaged with the educational programs, began learning English from Sergeant Morrison, started making plans for her eventual return to Hamburg and what she would say to Hans and Werner about her service and Germany's crimes. I will tell them everything, Gisela said to Frieda one evening, about the propaganda we believed, about the camps, about how we failed to question what was happening around us. They deserve the truth, even if the truth makes them ashamed of their mother. Not all prisoners received such reassuring news. Of the 218 women at Camp Shanks, perhaps 70 received some form of communication from family in Germany during the first 6 months of 1946. The others existed in uncertainty, not knowing if the parents, siblings, or children had survived. This not knowing was its own form of torture, imagination filling the void with every possible horror. In March of 1946, repatriation lists began circulating. Prisoners cleared of serious war crimes. Through denazification, screening would begin returning to Germany in phases. The process was bureaucratic and slow, requiring extensive documentation and multiple interviews. Each prisoner was classified according to her level of involvement with Nazi ideology: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, or exonerated persons. These classifications would determine their treatment in occupied Germany, affecting employment opportunities, housing access, and political rights. Frieda received her classification in April. Follower. The designation acknowledged that she had served the military, but found no evidence of active participation in war crimes or enthusiastic embrace of Nazi ideology. She would face restrictions, prohibited from certain professions, and required to complete denazification education programs. But she would not face prosecution or severe punishment. The news brought complicated emotions. Relief at avoiding harsher penalties mingled with guilt that her culpability seemed officially minimized. She had enabled communications that helped Germany prosecute a genocidal war, yet she was classified merely as a follower, a category suggesting passive compliance rather than active participation. Was this justice, or convenient categorization of moral complexity into bureaucratically manageable boxes? Her repatriation was scheduled for June. She would return to Germany through the American occupation zone, traveling by ship to Bremerhaven, then by train to wherever she could find housing and employment. Anneliese would remain in America with Clara. The separation would be indefinite, perhaps permanent. International adoption laws were being revised, and there was discussion of allowing Clara to formally adopt Anneliese, making her an American citizen. Frieda agonized over this decision. Part of her wanted Anneliese in Germany, wanted to rebuild their family despite the hardships. But another part recognized that America offered opportunities Germany could not provide, safety from the poverty and chaos consuming her homeland. In the end, she wrote to Clara giving her blessing for adoption if Clara chose to pursue it. "Let her be American," Frieda wrote in careful English practiced over months. "Let her grow up in a nation that showed mercy to enemies. Let her escape the burden of being German in a world that will despise Germany for generations. I will love her regardless of what passport she carries." The response from Clara came 3 weeks later. The old woman had decided to pursue adoption, believing it best for Anneliese's future, but she promised to maintain Frieda's connection to her daughter, to facilitate letters and perhaps eventually visits if circumstances allowed. "She will know her mother," Clara wrote. "She will know you loved her enough to let her go. This is the hardest gift a parent can give, and it speaks to your character that you make this choice." May brought warm weather and the beginning of large-scale repatriation operations. Women scheduled for June departure watched as earlier groups boarded trucks for transport to the port. The departures were somber affairs, prisoners leaving with mixed emotions toward the camp that had confined them but also kept them fed and safe while Germany starved. Sergeant Morrison bid farewell to women she had guarded for nearly a year. The relationships had been complicated, enemy and captor evolving into something more nuanced through daily interaction. She had learned German from them. They had learned English from her. They had shared moments of unexpected connection, jokes that transcended language barriers, assistance during illnesses, mutual recognition of shared humanity despite ideological chasms. "What will you do when you return?" Morrison asked Frieda during one of their final conversations. "Rebuild," Frieda replied simply. "Find work if possible, though my classification will make that difficult. Tell the truth to anyone who will listen. Try to help Germany become something better than what it was. It seems an impossible task, but the alternative is accepting that my generation destroyed everything and left only ruins." Morrison nodded slowly. "I think you'll succeed. You're stronger than you know." The compliment from her former captor made Frieda's eyes sting with tears. "You showed me mercy I did not deserve. You and Colonel Henderson and Dorothy Chen and all the others who arranged for me to see Anneliese, who gave us hot cocoa on Christmas, who treated us as human beings rather than monsters. I will remember this kindness and try to deserve it retroactively, if such a thing is possible." On June 14th, 1946, Frieda Baumann boarded a Liberty ship at New York Harbor for transport back to Germany. She stood at the rail as the vessel pulled away from the dock, watching the American coastline recede. Somewhere in that vast city, Anneliese was attending school, speaking English, becoming American. The separation felt like a physical wound, but Frieda told herself it was the right choice, perhaps the first truly selfless choice she had made since the war began. The voyage took 11 days, the ship packed with repatriating prisoners and displaced persons. Conditions were crowded but adequate. Nothing like the horror stories of wartime transport. Frieda spent much of the journey writing in a journal Colonel Henderson had given her as a departure gift. She documented everything: her capture, her months at Camp Shanks, the Christmas visit with Anneliese, the educational programs that had forced her to confront terrible truths, the kindness of people like Morrison and Chen who had treated enemies with unexpected humanity. "This record is for Anneliese," she wrote in the journal's first entry, "so that when she is old enough to understand, she will know her mother's story without evasion or excuse. So she will know what Germany did, what I enabled, and what Americans showed us about mercy and civilization. So she will learn from our failures and build something better." The ship arrived in Bremerhaven on June 25th. The port was partially destroyed, cranes twisted by bombing, docks damaged but functional. American occupation forces processed the arriving repatriates with efficient bureaucracy, checking documentation, directing people toward temporary housing or transport connections to other zones. Frieda's first glimpse of Germany in over a year shocked her despite intellectual preparation. Bremerhaven was a skeleton of its former self. Buildings stood without roofs, walls without windows, rubble was everywhere, piled in streets, blocking sidewalks, creating lunar landscapes where neighborhoods had once existed. German civilians moved through this devastation like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that were more patches than original fabric. The contrast with America was devastating. She had spent 14 months in a country where even prisoners ate regularly, where buildings had heat and electricity, where the machinery of daily life continued functioning. Now she returned to a nation that had been comprehensively destroyed, where survival itself required constant effort, where the future seemed almost impossible to imagine. From Bremerhaven, Frieda travelled by train to Frankfurt in the American occupation zone. The journey took 2 days, the rail system damaged and operating on reduced schedules. She stared out windows at passing countryside, seeing fields left fallow for lack of labour, villages destroyed in the war's final battles, bridges rebuilt with temporary structures. Germany in the summer of 1946 existed in a state that historians would later term 0 hour, a moment of total collapse from which reconstruction seemed nearly impossible. According to research compiled by historian Frederick Taylor in his work on post-war Germany, the scale of destruction defied easy comprehension. An estimated 20% of Germany's housing stock had been destroyed. Major cities had lost 50% or more of their buildings. Transportation infrastructure was shattered. Industrial capacity was dramatically reduced, both from bombing and from Allied dismantling of factories as reparations. But the physical destruction was matched by psychological and moral devastation, as the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable through trials and documentation. Many Germans retreated into denial, self-pity, or claims of victimhood. Others engaged in what would later be called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, working through the past, attempting to reckon honestly with what had been done in Germany's name. Frieda arrived in Frankfurt on June 28th. She had no family there, no specific destination, only a determination to find work and housing. The American military government operated a displaced persons bureau that helped returnees navigate the chaos. A tired administrator, a German woman in her 50s named Helga Schmidt, processed Frieda's papers with efficient disinterest. "Your classification is follower," Schmidt noted. "You're restricted from certain professions. Teaching, civil service, journalism. You'll need to complete denazification education before those restrictions can be reconsidered. For now, you can register for housing assistance and food rations. Current allocation is 1,500 calories per day for normal consumers, less than minimum nutritional requirements, but better than many civilians received during the war's final year." The bureaucratic language reduced catastrophe to administrative categories, but Frieda understood the reality. She would struggle to find work. She would be hungry. She would live in damaged housing with inadequate heat and sporadic electricity. This was the future awaiting her, the consequence of choices made years earlier when she had accepted Nazi explanations rather than questioning them. She found a room in a partially destroyed apartment building, sharing space with 3 other women in similar circumstances. The building had no running water, electricity functioned intermittently, and the roof leaked when it rained. But it was shelter, which made it precious in a city where thousands lived in cellars and ruins. Work proved difficult to obtain. Her Luftwaffe service and follower classification made employers wary, even in the chaotic labor market of post-war Germany. She eventually found irregular employment doing laundry for American occupation personnel, back-breaking work that paid barely enough to supplement her ration card. The Americans she worked for treated her with distant politeness, professional but not friendly. She was the enemy, even if a defeated and diminished one. The irony did not escape her. She washed uniforms for American soldiers, including some Women's Army Corps members who reminded her of Sergeant Morrison. These women had defeated Germany, occupied her country, now employed her in menial labor. Yet they had also shown her daughter mercy, had arranged that Christmas visit, had given her hot cocoa when she wept. The complexity of these relationships resisted simple categorization into victor and vanquished, enemy and friend. In August, Frieda received her first letter from Anneliese, forwarded through the Red Cross. The 8-year-old's handwriting was careful, her English improving rapidly, though she still included some German phrases. She wrote about school, about Clara, about her life in Brooklyn. She did not mention Germany or the war, or ask when Frieda would return. The omissions spoke volumes about a child learning to navigate impossible emotional terrain. Frieda responded immediately, writing in German because her English remained limited. She told Anneliese about Frankfurt, carefully editing the hardship to avoid worrying her daughter. She described the Roma, the historic city hall that had survived bombing, and the main river, where Germans went to fish or simply sit in rare moments of leisure. She did not mention the hunger, the cold, the constant exhaustion of simply surviving. Those burdens were not for Anneliese to carry. The correspondence continued throughout 1946 and into 1947. Letters arrived irregularly, sometimes taking months to traverse the Atlantic through military and Red Cross channels, but they came, maintaining a connection that transcended the physical separation. Anneliese's letters gradually contained less German, more English, as she assimilated into American life. She wrote about American holidays, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas with its stockings and hot cocoa, traditions that were becoming hers rather than inherited German customs. Frieda celebrated these adaptations even as they pained her. This was what she had chosen, what she had sacrificed for. Anneliese would be American, would escape the burden of German guilt, would build a life in a nation that had shown mercy to its enemies. The price was permanent separation, but Frieda told herself it was worth paying. In January of 1947, Frieda began attending the mandatory denazification education program required by her classification. The classes were conducted by German instructors approved by American occupation authorities, covering democratic principles, accurate history of the Nazi period, and analysis of propaganda techniques that had enabled the regime's rise and maintenance of power. Professor Hans Müller, the primary instructor, was 62 years old, a historian who had lost his university position in 1935 for refusing to teach Nazi racial ideology. He had survived the war years in internal exile, teaching privately, witnessing his nation's descent into barbarism. Now he worked to educate those who had enabled that descent, a task he approached with grim determination. "You must understand," Müller told his class of 40 former soldiers and party members, that Nazism did not appear from nowhere. It arose from German soil, from real grievances exploited by demagogues, from economic crisis and national humiliation following the Great War. These were genuine problems, but the Nazi solution was monstrous, and you chose to follow it rather than seeking alternatives. That choice, multiplied by millions, enabled genocide. The classes forced Frieda to confront aspects of her service she had avoided examining. How her work coordinating Luftwaffe communications had enabled strategic bombing campaigns against civilian targets. How her uncritical acceptance of authority had made her an efficient cog in a machine designed for conquest and murder. How her silence when Jewish neighbors disappeared, when Nuremberg laws stripped away civil rights, when propaganda portrayed entire categories of humans as subhuman. All of these silences had accumulated into complicity, The reckoning was psychologically brutal. Some classmates resisted, maintaining defensive postures, arguing they had merely followed orders or claiming ignorance. Others, like Frieda, accepted the accusations as deserved, struggling to integrate this knowledge into some coherent sense of self that allowed continued existence. How did one live with the understanding that one's past service had enabled industrialized murder? Müller offered no easy comfort. Guilt is appropriate, he said. Guilt that leads to genuine transformation, to commitment to different values, to active resistance against future fascism. But guilt that becomes paralyzing self-hatred serves no one. Germany needs citizens capable of building democratic institutions, of teaching the next generation different values, of ensuring this never happens again. You cannot do that work if you are destroyed by guilt. You must carry it, learn from it, let it motivate better choices, but not be consumed by it. The balance Müller described seemed almost impossibly difficult to achieve. Yet, Frieda tried. She continued her laundry work, began volunteering at a school teaching basic literacy to children who had missed years of education, slowly rebuilt a life from fragments. She wrote to Anneliese monthly, maintained correspondence with Clara, received occasional photographs showing her daughter growing taller, more confident, more American with each passing year. In June of 1947, Frieda received unexpected news. Colonel Henderson, who had commanded Camp Shanks, had written to her through military channels. The letter explained that he was retiring from service and had wanted to contact some of the prisoners he had overseen to learn how they were faring in post-war Germany. "Your case has stayed with me," Henderson wrote. "The Christmas program was controversial, and I faced criticism for it. But I believed then and believe now that it was the right choice, showing mercy to defeated enemies, acknowledging the humanity of prisoners' children. These actions represented American values at their best. I hope you are rebuilding your life and that your daughter thrives in America. Please write if you are willing to share your story." Frieda responded with a long letter detailing her return to Germany, her struggles and small successes, her continuing connection with Anneliese despite distance. She thanked Henderson for the Christmas visit, explaining that those 2 hours with her daughter had given her reason to survive, to work toward becoming someone worthy of that mercy. Henderson's reply came 3 months later. He had shared Frieda's story with Sergeant Morrison, who had also left military service and returned to Nebraska. Morrison sent her own letter, warm and personal, asking about Frieda's welfare and sharing news that she had married and was teaching at a local school. "I think of you and the other women from Camp Shanks," Morrison wrote. "I hope you are well. I hope Germany finds a way forward that honors the dead by building something genuinely different. Please give my regards to your daughter if you write to her. Tell her that even during the war, we recognized her mother's love for her. That love transcended everything else." These connections, enemy and captor maintaining correspondence years after the war, represented something unprecedented in history. They testified to the possibility of human relationships transcending political divisions, of mercy creating bonds that outlasted conflict. The letters would continue for years, documenting parallel lives being rebuilt from war's ruins. In December of 1947, Frieda completed her denazification education program. Her restrictions were partially lifted, allowing her to seek employment in teaching, though she would remain monitored and subject to review. She found a position at a Frankfurt elementary school, teaching German literature and basic arithmetic to children who reminded her constantly of Anneliese. The work was meaningful but painful. These children had grown up during war, had experienced bombing and hunger and loss. They carried trauma that would mark their generation permanently. Yet they also represented hope, the possibility that the next generation might build something better if taught different values than those that had consumed their parents' generation. Frieda taught them literature, yes, but also critical thinking, how to question authority, how to recognize propaganda, how to resist when leaders demanded obedience to immoral commands. Some parents objected to this approach, preferring traditional rote learning. But occupation authorities supported teachers who emphasized democratic values and critical analysis, seeing education as crucial to Germany's transformation. Christmas of 1947 arrived, and Frieda spent it alone in her small room. She had no money for celebration, no family nearby, no particular reason for festivity. Yet she found herself thinking about Christmas 2 years earlier, about hot cocoa in a prisoner of war camp, about seeing Anneliese for 2 precious hours, about Americans showing mercy to women who had served a genocidal regime. She had saved 1 tea bag from her ration, something precious hoarded for a special occasion. On Christmas Eve, she boiled water on the single burner she shared with other building residents, made tea, and sat by her window watching snow fall on Frankfurt's ruins. The tea was bitter, nothing like the sweet hot cocoa Sergeant Morrison had provided, but it connected her to that memory, to that moment when enemy soldiers had acknowledged her humanity despite everything. On Christmas Day, she wrote letters to 3 people, Anneliese in Brooklyn, Colonel Henderson in retirement, and Sergeant Morrison in Nebraska. To each, she described her gratitude for that Christmas of 1945, explaining how it had changed her understanding of mercy, civilization, and the possibility of redemption. "You showed me that strength includes compassion," she wrote to Henderson. "That victory need not mean vengeance, that even enemies can be treated with humanity. This lesson has guided my work teaching German children to build a different nation than the one my generation created. I will carry this lesson forward and ensure it is not forgotten." The letters were posted, traveling across continents to reach recipients who had once been enemies, but had become something more complex through acts of unexpected grace. The responses would come months later, continuing conversations that had begun in a prisoner of war camp and now stretched across years and oceans, connecting people whose lives had intersected briefly but meaningfully at a moment when history pivoted from war toward uncertain peace. According to historical research on the American occupation of Germany, the years from 1945 through 1949 represented a period of extraordinary transformation. The Marshall Plan would eventually pour billions of dollars into European reconstruction. Political reforms would establish democratic institutions in Western Germany. Educational programs would work to denazify and democratize a population raised under totalitarianism. The process was imperfect, incomplete, and would take generations to fully manifest. But it represented a choice by the victors to rebuild rather than simply punish, to plant seeds of future partnership rather than cultivating permanent enmity. Individual acts like the Christmas program at Camp Shanks were tiny components of this larger transformation. They did not erase German crimes or absolve German guilt, but they demonstrated an alternative to cycles of revenge that had characterized previous conflicts. They showed that mercy was possible even toward those who had enabled terrible evil, and they planted seeds in specific hearts and minds, seeds that would grow into commitments to build something better. Frieda Baumann was one person among millions grappling with Germany's catastrophic past and uncertain future. Her story was neither unique nor particularly heroic. She had enabled evil through passive compliance, had benefited from a system built on genocide, had chosen comfort over moral courage. These facts could not be erased or minimized, but she had also learned, slowly and painfully, to acknowledge these truths. She had accepted responsibility without retreating into paralysis. She had worked, in her small way, to teach the next generation different values, and she had carried forward the lesson of that Christmas when Americans gave hot cocoa to weeping German prisoners, demonstrating that civilization could survive even total war if mercy was chosen over vengeance. By 1950, as the Federal Republic of Germany was being established in the Western zones, Frieda had become a respected teacher at her Frankfurt school. Her past service was known, her denazification classification public record, yet she was trusted to educate children because she had demonstrated genuine transformation. She taught with an intensity born from understanding how education could be corrupted, how young minds could be shaped by propaganda, how critical thinking represented the best defense against future totalitarianism. Her classroom included children from various backgrounds, war orphans, children of former Nazi Party members, displaced persons from eastern territories now lost to Poland and the Soviet Union. She treated them all equally, teaching them that their parents' choices need not determine their destinies, that they could build a different Germany if they committed to democratic values, and refused to repeat history's darkest chapters. Anneliese, meanwhile, thrived in America. The letters from Brooklyn described a young girl becoming a teenager, excelling in school, making friends, fully integrating into American life. Clara remained her guardian, having completed the adoption process in 1948. Anneliese kept her mother's surname, Baumann, as a connection to heritage, but she identified primarily as American, her German language skills fading despite Frieda's letters encouraging her to maintain them. In 1952, when Anneliese was 15, she visited Germany for the first time since her departure in 1945. Clara arranged the trip, convinced that Anneliese needed to see her homeland and reconnect with her mother beyond letters. The visit was supervised, Clara accompanying Anneliese throughout, but it allowed mother and daughter to spend 2 weeks together for the first time in 7 years. The reunion was awkward and profound. Anneliese spoke primarily English now, her German heavily accented and limited. Frieda's English had improved through continued study, allowing communication but highlighting the linguistic and cultural distance that had grown between them. Yet beneath these barriers, essential connection persisted. They were mother and daughter, linked by bonds that transcended separation and circumstance. Frieda showed Anneliese the school where she taught, introduced her to colleagues and students, took her to see Frankfurt's cathedral and the Roma and other sites that had survived destruction. She also took her daughter to see the ruins that remained, the empty spaces where buildings had once stood, the memorials being erected to commemorate victims of Nazi persecution. "I want you to understand what Germany did," Frieda said during one of these tours. "Not to burden you with guilt that is not yours to carry, but so you understand why your life in America is precious. America showed mercy to its enemies, gave you opportunities Germany destroyed. Remember this when you become an adult and face difficult choices. Remember that civilization requires constant work, that democracy is fragile, that ordinary people's choices accumulate into either freedom or tyranny." Anneliese listened with the seriousness of a teenager encountering adult complexity. She did not fully comprehend. How could she at 15? But seeds were planted, understanding that would mature as she grew older and gained perspective on her mother's generation and the choices they had faced. The visit concluded with a day trip to Wiesbaden, where they attended a concert of classical music. German composers performed by musicians rebuilding cultural life from war's ruins. Sitting in the concert hall, listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with its triumphant chorale celebrating universal brotherhood, Frieda felt something approaching peace. Not absolution, never that, but acceptance of her past and commitment to her present. She had enabled terrible things, but she was working to build something better. She had lost years with her daughter, but Anneliese was safe and thriving. The price had been high, but perhaps not meaningless. They said goodbye at Frankfurt's railway station, Anneliese and Clara boarding a train that would take them back to Bremerhaven for their return voyage to America. Frieda stood on the platform, watching the train disappear, feeling the familiar ache of separation but also gratitude. Her daughter had come, had seen Germany honestly, had heard truths about the past without evasion. The relationship would continue through letters, perhaps future visits, a connection maintained across distance through determination and love. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.